The night air over the Nile River was still warm, even after the sun had long disappeared behind the dark edge of the western desert. A slow breeze moved across the black water, carrying the smell of wet reeds, mud, smoke, and baked grain. Small oil lamps flickered inside mudbrick homes along the riverbanks, their soft yellow light trembling gently through woven reed windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Most of the village had already gone to sleep. The workers who spent the day carrying stones or digging irrigation canals now rested on simple mats laid across cool floors of packed earth. Farmers slept beside their tools. Children curled quietly beside their mothers. Old men breathed slowly beneath thin linen cloths while the night insects hummed softly outside. Ancient Egypt became quieter after dark. During the day, the riverbanks were crowded with movement. Boats drifted past loaded with baskets of grain. Fishermen pulled heavy nets from the water. Bakers worked beside clay ovens glowing with heat. Scribes sat beneath shaded awnings with brushes and papyrus sheets resting in their laps. Everywhere there had been dust, noise, sweat, labor, and heat. But at night, another Egypt appeared. A softer Egypt. An Egypt of dim firelight and slow breathing. An Egypt where tired people rested their aching feet after another long day that looked very much like the day before it. And perhaps that was the strangest thing of all. For many ordinary Egyptians, life changed very little from one sunrise to the next. The same roads were walked. The same tools were lifted. The same prayers were whispered. The same river water was carried home in clay jars balanced carefully against tired shoulders. And very often, the same meals were eaten too. Again and again. Day after day. Year after year. Inside one small house near the river, a woman sat beside a low grinding stone even though the night had grown late. Her hands moved slowly across the grain as she prepared flour for the next morning. The motion was steady and practiced. She did not need to think about it anymore. Her shoulders ached from years of repeating this work, but the rhythm lived inside her now like breathing. Beside her rested baskets filled with barley and emmer wheat. These grains formed the center of life for most Egyptians. They became bread. They became porridge. They became beer. Morning after morning, afternoon after afternoon, people ate the same simple foods because these foods were dependable. Dependable mattered more than variety. A rich noble living in a painted villa might taste roasted duck with figs and honey during festivals. Priests in temple kitchens sometimes enjoyed special meals prepared carefully for ceremonies. But most people did not live this way. Most people woke before sunrise already thinking about bread. The woman beside the grinding stone paused for a moment and flexed her fingers. Tiny grains of flour clung to her skin. Her youngest child slept nearby, wrapped lightly in linen. Outside, the village had grown almost completely silent now except for the distant sound of water touching the shore. Tomorrow would begin early again. Before the first pale light reached the eastern horizon, fires would already be burning inside kitchens across the settlement. Clay ovens would warm slowly while women kneaded dough in wide bowls. Bakers would shape rough loaves by hand. Some bread would be flat and simple. Some would be thicker and darker. Sometimes herbs or dates were mixed into the dough when families could spare them. But usually, the bread remained plain. Plain bread filled empty stomachs. Plain bread gave strength for labor beneath the crushing Egyptian sun. And so plain bread appeared every day. A man who spent 10 hours carrying stone blocks beneath the heat did not dream of complicated meals. He dreamed of enough food to continue working tomorrow. His life depended on routine. His body depended on predictability. Ancient Egypt was a world built on cycles. The Nile flooded. The water retreated. Seeds were planted. Crops grew. Grain was harvested. Bread was baked. Then the cycle began again. Even the stars above seemed to move in patient routines. The people of Egypt trusted repetition because repetition meant survival. A sudden change in weather could destroy a harvest. A failed flood could bring hunger. Too much water could wash away fields entirely. Simple meals were safe meals. Meals made from grains stored carefully in sealed containers could last through difficult months. Bread could travel. Beer could nourish tired workers. Dried onions, lentils, and fish could survive long journeys and hard seasons. There was comfort in knowing what tomorrow's meal would be. For many Egyptians, breakfast came shortly after sunrise. The morning air still carried some coolness then. Workers gathered before beginning their labor. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while mothers distributed pieces of bread onto low wooden trays. The bread was coarse compared to modern bread. Tiny particles from grinding stones often remained mixed into the flour. Over many years, these hard grains slowly wore down Egyptian teeth. Archaeologists thousands of years later would discover skulls with badly damaged mouths from a lifetime of eating stone-filled bread. But in the quiet morning hours of ancient Egypt, nobody thought about archaeology or distant futures. They thought about getting through the day. A laborer might dip bread into beer to soften it. A fisherman might eat onions with coarse loaves before rowing into the river mist. A child might chew slowly while watching sunlight spread across mud-brick walls. Again and again, the same foods appeared because Egypt itself encouraged sameness. The climate shaped everything. The hot weather spoiled fresh food quickly. Meat was difficult to preserve unless salted or dried carefully. Livestock required space and resources. Most families could not slaughter animals often. Cattle were valuable for farming and transport. Goats provided milk. Ducks and geese were usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. So ordinary people relied on what the land provided most steadily. Grain. Beer. Onions. Garlic. Lentils. Beans. Fish from the Nile. Dates when available. Figs when possible. Simple foods. Filling foods. Foods that could survive heat and storage. Inside crowded workshops, workers paused during midday to eat quickly before returning to their labor. The air smelled of sweat, clay dust, smoke, and hot stone. Sandals scraped against floors while men sat shoulder to shoulder sharing rough meals from baskets and jars. Nobody expected surprise at lunchtime. The meal was familiar before it even began. And strangely, familiarity itself became comforting. A stonecutter working near a temple construction site already knew the taste waiting for him before he opened his cloth wrapping. Bread. Maybe dried fish. Perhaps onions. Weak beer carried in a clay jar to fight thirst beneath the heat. The predictability of food matched the predictability of labor. Every morning the same hammer struck stone. Every afternoon the same muscles burned with exhaustion. Every evening the same dusty roads led home. The sameness of meals reflected the sameness of survival. As the years passed, routine settled deeply into Egyptian life. Children learned recipes from watching their mothers and grandmothers. Bakers shaped loaves using techniques older than memory itself. Fishermen salted catches beneath the sun exactly as their fathers had done. The Nile River tied all these lives together. At dawn, the river often appeared silver beneath soft morning light. Boats drifted quietly through thin layers of mist while birds called from marsh reeds. Farmers walked narrow dirt paths carrying hoes across their shoulders. Water carriers balanced jars carefully against their hips. Many of them had eaten the same breakfast the day before, and the week before that, and likely for most of their lives. Yet this repetition did not always feel miserable to them. Modern people often chase endless choice, endless flavors, endless variety. Ancient Egypt moved differently. There was peace in routine. Peace in knowing the grain stores were full. Peace in hearing dough slapped against wooden boards before sunrise. Peace in smelling bread ovens warming while the village slowly awakened. For exhausted workers, familiar food could feel reassuring after difficult labor. A bowl of lentils beside warm bread meant the family had survived another day. That mattered more than excitement. The heavy Egyptian heat also changed the rhythm of appetite. By midday, the air itself seemed thick and exhausting. Sweat-soaked linen clothing. Dust clung to skin. Workers moved slowly beneath blazing sunlight while flies circled lazily through workshops and fields. Simple meals were easier in such conditions. Large complicated feasts belonged mostly to ceremonies, festivals, or wealthy households. Ordinary people needed food that could be prepared efficiently and shared among many mouths. Near the center of one village, a baker rose every morning long before sunrise. He stepped outside while stars still filled the sky above the river. The ground remained cool beneath his sandals then. For a few brief moments before dawn, Egypt felt almost peaceful enough to forget the coming heat. He mixed flour and water by lamplight. His hands moved automatically. Knead. Fold. Press. Repeat. Around him, the village slowly began to stir awake. Roosters called somewhere in the darkness. A donkey shifted beside a stable wall. Smoke curled upward from the first cooking fires. Soon workers would arrive carrying baskets or small bits of trade. Some brought grain. Others exchanged labor. Bread moved through Egyptian life almost like currency itself. It fed families, paid workers, supplied temples, and filled storage rooms across the kingdom. Without bread, much of Egypt simply stopped functioning. And so the baker repeated the same work each day because thousands of other people repeated the same hunger. When the first sunlight touched the eastern horizon, warm orange light spread slowly across the Nile water. Palm trees cast long shadows across muddy paths. Villagers emerged from homes blinking into the morning brightness. Children carried jars. Men lifted tools. Women swept dust from floors. And somewhere in nearly every home, someone prepared the same familiar meal again. Bread torn by hand. Beer poured carefully into cups. Perhaps onions or beans. Maybe dried fish if the family had enough. The food itself was not luxurious, but the act of eating together mattered deeply. Families sat closely in small rooms cooled slightly by thick mud brick walls. For a few quiet moments before work began, life slowed. Then labor called once more. The riverbanks became crowded with movement. Builders hauled limestone beneath the sun. Farmers guided oxen through wet soil left behind by Nile floods. Potters shaped clay beside spinning wheels. Scribes bent over records while sweat rolled slowly down their backs. Egypt survived because ordinary people repeated ordinary tasks endlessly. And food followed that same pattern. Even wealthy Egyptians often preferred familiar meals prepared in familiar ways. Human beings everywhere grow attached to routine, especially in difficult environments. The Egyptian climate demanded careful planning. Crops had to be stored properly. Water had to be managed carefully. Food waste could become dangerous. A household that depended on simple dependable meals stood a better chance during uncertain seasons. The Nile itself decided much about Egyptian eating habits. When the river flooded correctly, grain harvests remained strong. Villages celebrated quietly because full granaries meant safety. But when floodwaters rose poorly, anxiety spread through the land. Bakers worried. Farmers worried. Parents worried. In such moments, familiar foods became even more important. Bread stretched limited resources. Lentils filled stomachs cheaply. Beer provided calories and safer hydration than untreated water alone. Egyptian beer was thick compared to modern beer. It often contained bits of grain and provided real nourishment. Workers drank it throughout the day. Children sometimes drank weaker forms. Beer belonged to daily life so completely that many people probably considered it as ordinary as bread itself. And like bread, it rarely changed much. Near sunset, the desert heat slowly weakened. Long shadows stretched across roads and fields. Workers returned home exhausted. Their feet carried dust from miles of walking. Their backs hurt. Their hands felt rough from tools and rope. The smell of evening meals drifted softly through villages. Once again, many families prepared nearly the same foods they had eaten earlier. Perhaps thicker bread now. Perhaps lentil stew simmering slowly in clay pots. Maybe fish roasted lightly over open flame. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rare. Just enough. Enough to quiet hunger. Enough to prepare for tomorrow. Inside homes, conversations remained gentle and practical. Parents discussed grain supplies. Children grew sleepy beside flickering oil lamps. Outside, the Nile flowed patiently onward through darkness. And tomorrow would come again. Another sunrise. Another oven warming before dawn. Another laborer dipping bread into beer before carrying stone beneath the hot sky. Another fisherman rowing quietly through morning mist with onions wrapped beside rough loaves. The same meals continued because the same life continued. In many ways, ancient Egypt depended on repetition more than almost any civilization in history. The river repeated its floods. Priests repeated sacred rituals. Scribes copied the same symbols carefully across papyrus. Builders stacked stones in endless patterns beneath the sun. Repetition brought order. Order brought stability. And stability fed millions of people along the narrow green ribbon beside the Nile. Far away from royal palaces and temple treasures, ordinary Egyptians lived quieter lives than history books often describe. Most people never saw great ceremonies. Most people never entered magnificent tombs. Most people spent their days trying simply to work, eat, rest, and survive. Their meals reflected that reality. Simple. Reliable. Familiar. Night settled once more across the villages beside the river. Oil lamps glowed softly behind reed curtains. The smell of baked grain lingered faintly in the cooling air. Somewhere a tired mother prepared tomorrow's flour before finally lying down beside her sleeping children. The stars above ancient Egypt shone with calm and endless patience. And beneath them, countless ordinary people drifted slowly into sleep after another day nourished by the same humble foods their parents had eaten before them. Before the first birds began calling from the reeds along the Nile, the darkness over Egypt carried a strange and peaceful stillness. The villages rested beneath a sky crowded with pale stars. Cool air drifted slowly through narrow alleys between mudbrick homes. In some houses, tiny cooking fires had already begun to glow again, their soft orange light flickering against walls darkened by years of smoke. The people of Egypt rarely slept late. The rhythm of the land did not allow it. Long before the harsh heat of midday arrived, labor had to begin. Bread had to be baked. Water had to be carried. Nets had to be repaired. Animals had to be fed. The Nile itself seemed to awaken early, reflecting the faint gray light spreading quietly across the eastern horizon. Inside a small home near the riverbank, an elderly woman sat awake beside a grinding stone. Her knees hurt now when she bent forward, and her fingers had grown stiff with age, but she still woke before everyone else in the house. The grinding of grain had become part of her life so completely that silence itself felt unusual without it. Stone against grain. Grain against stone. A slow and endless sound. Her mother had done the same thing many years before. Her daughters now did it beside her. The work passed quietly through generations like the river water flowing endlessly northward. Nearby, sacks filled with barley rested against the wall. The family guarded them carefully. Grain meant safety. Grain meant survival during poor floods or difficult seasons. Families counted grain carefully because they understood how fragile life could become when food supplies weakened. And so every handful mattered. The old woman paused for a moment and listened to the sleeping house around her. She could hear soft breathing beneath linen blankets spread across the floor. Outside, sandals scraped faintly somewhere in the darkness as another early worker crossed the village road. Soon the ovens would grow hot again. Soon the smell of bread would drift across the waking settlement. The meals waiting for these families would not surprise anyone. There would be coarse bread, perhaps still warm from the oven. There would be beer stored in clay jars. Maybe onions or beans. If fortune had been kind recently, there might be dates or dried fish as well. The same foods. The same morning. The same beginning to another long day. Yet the people preparing these meals were not thinking about sameness in the way modern minds might. They were thinking about hunger, exhaustion, and work waiting just beyond sunrise. In ancient Egypt, routine often felt safer than change. A fisherman walking toward the river before dawn carried a small cloth bundle tucked beneath his arm. Inside waited his breakfast and midday meal. He already knew its taste without opening it. Bread hardened slightly from yesterday's baking. Salted fish wrapped carefully in leaves. A few onions with dry outer skins crackling softly when touched. As he walked through the dim streets, he passed other workers beginning their own journeys into morning. A farmer led tired oxen toward the fields. A young boy carried empty water jars. A baker stacked wood beside his oven. A scribe adjusted the strap of a papyrus case against his shoulder. All of them had likely eaten nearly the same meals yesterday. And the day before that. And still, life continued steadily forward. The Nile River shaped not only Egypt's economy and farming, but also the emotional rhythm of daily existence. The river rewarded patience and preparation. Crops could not be rushed. Harvests depended on timing. Food storage demanded careful planning across entire seasons. People learned to trust habits. The fishermen reached the riverbank just as the eastern sky began turning pale blue. Thin mist hovered above the water. Boats knocked softly against wooden posts while distant birds moved across the marsh reeds searching for food. He sat briefly before beginning work and ate a piece of bread in silence. The bread was rough and dense. Tiny grains crunched faintly between his teeth. He chewed slowly while watching sunlight spread across the calm surface of the Nile. There was no hurry in this moment. Only quiet. Only the coolness of early morning before the heat arrived. Only the familiar taste of another ordinary meal. Across Egypt, thousands of similar mornings unfolded at the same time. In larger towns, the streets slowly filled with movement as the day brightened. Donkeys carried baskets through dusty roads. Merchants arranged vegetables beneath woven awnings. Potters opened workshops already warm from trapped heat. The smell of baking grain mixed with smoke, river mud, sweat, and animals. And everywhere people ate the foods their bodies knew best. Egyptian diet stayed simple partly because ordinary labor demanded enormous physical endurance. Workers building tombs, canals, walls, or temples burned tremendous energy beneath the desert sun. Their muscles needed reliable nourishment more than luxury. Heavy bread filled the stomach. Beer restored strength and hydration. Lentils and beans lasted long in storage. Onions traveled easily and resisted spoilage. These foods became trusted companions to labor itself. At a stone quarry far from the greener Nile banks, men paused during mid-morning to rest briefly in the shade of unfinished blocks. Dust coated their skin and settled into their hair. Their linen clothing clung damply against their backs from sweat. One worker removed bread from a cloth wrapping and broke it carefully with both hands. Another shared onions sliced roughly with a bronze knife dulled from years of use. Clay jars of beer passed slowly among the group. Nobody complained about the lack of variety. Hunger changed expectations. When bodies ached from lifting stone beneath relentless heat, familiar food felt deeply satisfying. A full stomach meant enough strength to survive another day of labor. That alone carried comfort. Some workers even preferred sameness because it removed uncertainty from their difficult lives. They knew how long their grain stores would last. They knew how much beer to prepare. They knew what foods could survive transport across hot distances. The rhythm became dependable. Morning bread. Midday bread. Evening stew. Rest. Then begin again. The wealthy lived differently, of course, but even noble households remained connected to Egypt's agricultural cycles. Large estates stored huge amounts of grain. Bakers worked constantly inside palace kitchens. Servants carried baskets overflowing with figs, dates, garlic, herbs, and roasted meats during feasts. Yet beyond celebrations and ceremonies, even many rich Egyptians relied heavily on familiar staples. Bread still stood at the center of meals. Beer still flowed daily through households both poor and wealthy. The grain economy touched everyone. In one riverside home, a young mother stirred lentils slowly inside a clay pot while her children slept nearby through the hottest hours of afternoon. Outside, sunlight pressed heavily against the village. Dogs searched for shade beneath carts. Workers moved more slowly now, drained by heat rising from stone roads and mud walls alike. The woman added onions to the stew and watched steam curl upward into the dim room. This meal would taste almost identical to yesterday's. Still, her family would welcome it gratefully when evening arrived. Food in ancient Egypt often carried emotional meaning far beyond flavor. A simmering pot inside the home meant security. The smell of fresh bread meant the household still possessed grain. Shared meals reminded families they had endured another difficult day together. These quiet comforts mattered deeply in a world where disease, injury, failed harvests, and exhaustion always lingered nearby. Sometimes children grew tired of repetitive meals. A boy might complain softly while chewing another piece of coarse bread. A girl might stare longingly at richer foods carried through market streets toward wealthier homes. But most children learned early not to waste food or expect luxury. The desert surrounding Egypt allowed little room for carelessness. Beyond a narrow fertile strip beside the Nile waited endless dry land where almost nothing grew. The green fields existed only because the river flooded faithfully year after year. Egyptians understood this dependence with complete seriousness. And so their meals reflected respect for stability. A wealthy noble might enjoy roasted goose during a religious festival, but farmers preparing fields after flood season still depended on bread and onions. Temple priests might taste honey cakes during ceremonies, but fishermen repairing nets beside the river still packed simple grain meals before dawn. Ordinary life continued beneath the grand stories of kings and pyramids. In truth, most Egyptians probably spent more time thinking about bread than pharaohs. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, cooler air finally drifted across the villages again. Workers returned home along familiar dirt paths, sandals brushed through dust. Voices remained low from exhaustion. The river reflected deep gold beneath the lowering sun. Near one crowded neighborhood, several women baked bread together beside outdoor ovens. Children sat nearby watching sparks rise into the evening air. The women spoke softly while shaping dough with practiced hands. They discussed grain supplies, the coming flood season, an illness affecting a neighbor, a broken tool needing repair. Ordinary conversations of ordinary people. The bread they baked looked slightly different from loaf to loaf, but the ingredients remained largely the same as they had been for centuries. Emmer wheat, barley, water, salt when available. Simple things. Ancient Egypt survived through simple things repeated endlessly with patience. As darkness approached, lamps glowed softly through the village once more. The air cooled enough for people to breathe more comfortably. Some families sat outside their homes for a little while before sleep, enjoying the brief gentleness of evening. An old fisherman repaired torn netting beneath lantern light while eating dried fish and bread slowly beside his grandson. Nearby, a tired laborer stretched aching legs against a wall while his wife poured beer carefully into cups for supper. The meals remained modest. But modest meals shared peacefully after hard labor could still feel deeply comforting. The grandson beside the fisherman asked quietly why they ate fish so often. The old man smiled faintly. "Because the river gives fish," he answered. "Because grain grows beside the river. Because people eat what the river allows." The answer seemed simple enough. And perhaps that simplicity explained much about Egyptian life itself. People adapted themselves to the land around them. Over generations, their habits became traditions. Their traditions became culture. Their culture became daily routine so deeply rooted that it almost felt eternal. Even the smells of Egypt repeated endlessly across centuries. Warm bread, river water, smoke from cooking fires, sweat dried into linen cloth, wet mud after flood season, fish drying beneath the sun, garlic crushed beneath stone, dust carried by desert wind. These scents drifted through the lives of millions of ordinary people who likely never imagined distant futures or grand historical legacies. They thought instead about tomorrow's work, tomorrow's grain, tomorrow's meal. And tomorrow's meal would probably resemble today's very closely. Night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley. The stars returned one by one above the dark river. Frogs croaked softly near marshes while insects hummed beneath palm trees. The village fires burned lower now as families prepared for sleep. Inside one home, a father tore the final piece of bread from a loaf and handed it quietly to his youngest child. The little boy ate sleepily beside the fading lamp flame while his mother cleaned bowls with careful hands. Soon the room grew silent except for breathing. Outside, the Nile continued flowing patiently through darkness just as it had long before these people were born. And tomorrow morning, before sunrise arrived once more over ancient Egypt, ovens would warm again. Grinding stones would turn again. Bread would bake again. And countless tired hands would reach once more for the same familiar meals that carried them gently through another day beside the river. The moon hung low above the Nile Valley, pale and quiet against the dark sky, while much of Egypt slept beneath the cooling desert air. Along narrow village paths, the dust settled softly after a long day of footsteps. The ovens that had glowed with heat during the evening now rested in silence, their warmth fading slowly into the night. Inside the homes beside the river, families slept close together. Children rested beside their parents on woven mats spread across packed earth floors. Linen blankets lay lightly over tired bodies. Clay jars stood against walls beside baskets of grain carefully protected from insects and dampness. In the deepest hours before dawn, the world felt still enough that even the river seemed to move more softly. But Egypt never truly stopped. Somewhere in the darkness, a baker was already awake. In another house, an elderly servant rose quietly to prepare water before sunrise. A fisherman checked his nets beneath moonlight. A temple worker swept stone floors before morning prayers. The routines continued without pause. For thousands of years, the lives of ordinary Egyptians moved with remarkable steadiness. Seasons changed slowly. Dynasties rose and disappeared. New rulers came to power. Temples expanded beside the riverbanks. Yet for the people who worked the fields and baked the bread, daily life often remained familiar across generations. And nowhere was this more visible than in their meals. The same grains filled storage jars. The same bread baked inside clay ovens. The same onions hung drying beside doorways. The same fish cooked above small fires. Food became part of the rhythm of existence itself. In a small farming village south of Memphis, the first faint light of dawn slowly touched the horizon. The air still carried traces of coolness then, though everyone knew the heavy heat would return before long. A rooster cried somewhere near the edge of the settlement. Dogs stirred awake beneath carts and shade walls. Inside one mud-brick home, a young girl rubbed sleep from her eyes while her mother prepared breakfast beside a low table. The girl already knew what they would eat. Everyone did. Bread from yesterday's baking rested beneath linen cloth. A clay bowl held mashed beans mixed with herbs. Nearby stood a jar of weak beer that would be shared carefully among the family before work began. The mother tore the bread into pieces while smoke from the small cooking fire drifted upward toward the ceiling. Nothing about the meal was exciting. Nothing was meant to be. The food's purpose was not pleasure alone. Its purpose was strength, endurance, continuation. The family ate quietly while dawn brightened outside. Soon the father would walk toward the fields carrying wooden tools across his shoulders. The older sons would follow him. The mother would spend much of the day grinding grain, baking, carrying water, repairing clothing, and preparing the evening meal. The little girl would help where she could. And tomorrow would likely unfold almost the same way. Ancient Egypt depended on countless invisible routines repeated every day by ordinary people whose names history no longer remembers. Without these routines, the temples could not rise. The cities could not function. The rulers could not govern. The kingdom rested upon tired workers eating simple meals beside the Nile. As the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, the village became louder with movement. Donkeys brayed impatiently. Sandals scraped along dusty roads. Men called softly to one another while guiding animals toward the fields. The smell of baking bread drifted through the warming air. For many Egyptians, bread was more than food. Bread was reassurance. A household with enough bread could face tomorrow more calmly. Empty grain baskets brought fear quickly. Parents watched their stored supplies carefully because hunger always remained close enough to imagine. Some years the Nile flooded perfectly, leaving rich dark soil behind for planting. During those years, granaries filled well, and villages felt safer. Bakers shaped loaf after loaf while workers received steady rations. But other years brought worry. If the flood waters rose too low, the crops suffered. If the waters arrived too violently, fields disappeared beneath destruction. In uncertain seasons, people leaned even more heavily on dependable foods that could stretch across difficult months. A pot of lentils simmering slowly over a fire could feed many mouths. Bread filled stomachs cheaply. Beer provided nourishment even when little else remained. And so these foods appeared again and again across Egyptian life. At the edge of a busy market town, merchants arranged goods beneath woven canopies to protect them from the growing heat. Fish sellers displayed catches from the river. Potters stacked fresh clay bowls beside workshop entrances. Women carried baskets filled with onions, garlic, beans, and dates balanced expertly atop their heads. The market contained more variety than most homes could afford regularly, but even here the same core foods dominated daily trade. Grain stood at the center of everything. The wealth of Egypt itself was often measured through grain supplies. Workers received grain payments. Temples stored grain reserves. Taxes were collected in grain. Entire communities depended upon careful harvests and storage systems. And because grain mattered so deeply, bread became woven into nearly every part of life. Near the market entrance, a laborer sat beneath a shaded wall during a short rest from hauling stone blocks. Sweat darkened his linen clothing. Dust clung thickly to his arms and face. He opened a cloth wrapping slowly. Inside waited the same midday meal he had carried almost every day for years. Bread. Onions. A little dried fish. He ate without complaint. The familiar taste grounded him somehow. After hours beneath the blazing sun, familiar food could feel calming in its own quiet way. His body trusted these meals because these meals had carried him through countless exhausting days before. There was little space in Egyptian life for endless choice. Most people worked too hard and too long to think constantly about novelty. Survival itself demanded enough energy already. By midday, the heat spread heavily across the land. Air shimmered above roads and stone walls. Workers searched for small patches of shade whenever possible. The Nile reflected harsh sunlight so brightly that looking across the water could hurt tired eyes. Inside homes, women prepared food slowly through the hottest part of the day. Clay pots simmered gently over low fires while flies buzzed lazily through warm rooms. Children rested sleepily against walls after morning chores. Cooking itself required patience. Grinding grain took enormous effort. Kneading dough exhausted the arms and shoulders. Carrying water from the river demanded balance and strength. Smoke from cooking fires irritated the eyes and lungs inside enclosed spaces. Meals remained simple partly because complicated cooking required precious time and energy few families could spare. A wealthy household might employ servants and cooks, but ordinary families depended mostly on their own labor. Simpler meals allowed exhausted people to continue functioning day after day. And over time, simplicity became tradition. One elderly farmer sitting beneath a sycamore tree near the fields chewed slowly on coarse bread while watching younger workers guide oxen through dark soil. The farmer's teeth had worn badly over the years from gritty flour mixed with stone particles. Many older Egyptians suffered the same problem. Still, he ate carefully and calmly. The bread may have been rough, but it represented another successful harvest season behind him. Another year survived beside the Nile. The farmer remembered his childhood meals clearly because they differed so little from the food now resting in his hands. His mother had baked nearly identical bread decades earlier. His grandparents likely had too. The continuity stretched backward endlessly, generation after generation beside the river. Sometimes small changes appeared. A family might receive extra fish after a successful catch. A holiday might bring sweet cakes flavored with honey. A temple festival could provide richer foods briefly shared among crowds. But once the celebrations passed, ordinary routines returned quietly. Bread, beer, beans, onions, fish when possible. The meals of ancient Egypt remained close to the land itself. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, cooler winds finally drifted from the river once again. Workers returned from fields and workshops with tired movements. The roads filled gradually with people heading home beneath skies turning gold and orange above the desert edge. Children ran ahead barefoot through dust. Women carried water jars carefully against their hips. Men stretched sore backs while walking. The smell of evening cooking fires spread through the settlements. Inside one home, a mother stirred a thick stew made from lentils and garlic while her youngest son slept nearby against the wall. Her older children sat quietly waiting for the meal, too tired from the day's chores to speak much. When the father finally returned home, dust covered nearly every part of him. He washed his hands with water from a clay jar. Then the family sat together on the floor to eat. Outside, the village slowly darkened. Oil lamps flickered behind windows. The sounds of labor faded. A donkey brayed somewhere far away before falling silent again. The family shared their meal slowly, dipping pieces of bread into the warm stew. The father drank carefully from a cup of beer while listening to the quiet voices of his children. This simple moment repeated itself across thousands of Egyptian homes every evening. Not grand feasts. Not royal luxury. Just tired people eating familiar food beneath fading light after another day of work. And perhaps there was something deeply human about that quiet repetition. The Egyptian world often feels distant now, hidden behind statues, tombs, and ancient ruins worn smooth by time. But inside these small nightly meals existed lives very much like countless lives throughout history. People hoping their grain would last. Parents feeding children before sleep. Workers easing hunger after exhausting labor. Families finding comfort in familiar tastes and routines. As darkness settled fully across the Nile Valley, cooler air finally reached the homes and narrow streets. The stars appeared slowly above the river once more. Frogs called from wet marshes. Palm leaves rustled softly in the night breeze. Inside the houses, people prepared for sleep. Clay bowls were cleaned carefully because every possession mattered. Leftover bread was wrapped for tomorrow. Grain baskets were checked one last time. Oil lamps burned lower. In one small room, an old grandmother told a sleepy child stories while shaping dough for the next morning's baking. Her hands moved automatically in the dim light. Press. Fold. Turn. Repeat. The child watched quietly, eyes growing heavy with sleep. Outside, the Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness, carrying cool water past villages where millions of ordinary meals had already been eaten for countless generations. And before dawn arrived once more, ovens would glow again beside the river. The grinding stones would begin turning. The smell of warm bread would rise into the early air. And ancient Egypt would wake once more to another day shaped gently by labor, routine, heat, exhaustion, and the same familiar meals that carried its people steadily through time. In the deepest hours before sunrise, Egypt rested beneath a blanket of silence broken only by small and distant sounds. Water touched the muddy banks of the Nile with slow and gentle movements. Reeds whispered softly whenever the night wind passed through them. Somewhere beyond the sleeping houses, a lonely bird cried once into the darkness and then became quiet again. The air felt cooler now. For a few short hours each night, the heat loosened its grip on the land, allowing tired bodies to breathe more easily. Families slept close together beneath thin linen coverings while the faint smell of smoke still lingered from evening cooking fires. Inside many homes, grain rested in woven baskets beside the walls. Carefully guarded grain. Counted grain. Precious grain. The people of Egypt understood something simple and deeply important. As long as the grain remained safe, tomorrow could continue. Bread could still be baked. Workers could still labor. Children could still eat. And so much of Egyptian life quietly revolved around protecting, preparing, storing, and consuming the same dependable foods over and over again. In one small village north of Thebes, a baker rose while the stars still covered the sky. His sleeping children remained curled together near the back wall of the house while he stepped outside into the cool darkness. The ground felt smooth beneath his worn sandals. He carried wood toward the clay oven slowly, careful not to wake the neighbors whose homes stood only a few steps away. The village had not yet begun its daily noise. No carts rattled across the roads. No merchants shouted. No animals strained against harnesses. Only the soft crackle of kindling breaking beneath his hands. Soon the first flames flickered alive. The baker sat quietly beside the growing fire while waiting for the oven to heat. He looked upward for a moment at the pale stars fading slowly over the Nile Valley. He had seen this same sky nearly every morning of his life. The same stars. The same oven. The same bread. There was something strangely calming about such repetition. The baker did not think of himself as trapped by routine. Routine was simply life itself. His father had baked before him. His sons would likely bake after him. The village needed bread every day, and so each morning began with fire, flour, and patient hands. Soon his wife joined him carrying bowls of grain flour prepared the night before. Together they mixed water into the flour carefully, kneading the dough while the fire warmed the cool dawn air around them. Their movements required little conversation. Both already knew each step. Nearby, the eastern sky slowly brightened into pale shades of blue and gold. Another Egyptian morning was arriving. Across the Nile Valley, countless similar scenes unfolded quietly at the same hour. Women ground grain with heavy stones while children still slept nearby. Fishermen checked ropes and nets beside dark river banks. Farmers prepared tools before walking toward the fields. And almost everywhere, someone prepared bread. The smell drifted gradually through the villages as ovens warmed. Warm grain. Smoke. Yeast. Ash. Simple smells. Ancient smells. Smells that had greeted Egyptian mornings for centuries. In larger towns, workers already gathered before sunrise near construction sites and workshops. Men carrying baskets or tools paused to eat quickly before labor began. Some sat directly on the ground beside unfinished walls while sharing rough bread and onions. The food gave them strength, but it also gave them predictability. Predictability mattered in a difficult world. Most Egyptians could not control floods, droughts, illness, or the demands of powerful officials. But they could prepare familiar meals. They could store grain. They could maintain routines passed carefully from one generation to another. Even poor households often followed deeply established habits around food preparation. Meals appeared at expected times. Ingredients were used carefully. Leftovers were preserved whenever possible. Waste frightened people. Waste threatened survival. Near the edge of one village, a young mother walked toward the river carrying 2 clay jars balanced carefully against her hips. The morning remained pleasant for now, though already the first warmth of sunrise touched the tops of the palm trees. She moved slowly along a dusty footpath worn smooth by countless travelers before her. Other women walked nearby carrying jars of their own. Most of them had eaten similar breakfasts only moments earlier. Bread dipped into beer. Maybe a few dates if supplies allowed. Perhaps beans flavored lightly with herbs. Nobody spoke much while collecting water so early in the morning. Sleep still lingered heavily behind tired eyes. The mother knelt beside the riverbank and filled her jars while watching sunlight spread across the Nile. The river looked peaceful at this hour. Silver blue water. Soft ripples. Birds lifting slowly from the reeds. It became easy, in moments like these, to understand why Egyptians trusted repetition so deeply. The river itself repeated its movements endlessly. Flood and retreat. Flood and retreat. Season after season. Human life followed the same pattern. Eat. Work. Sleep. Begin again. The meals remained simple because simple meals fit naturally into that rhythm. Inside farming communities, labor consumed enormous portions of each day. During planting and harvest seasons especially, exhaustion spread through entire villages. Men worked bent beneath the sun for hours while women prepared food, carried water, cared for children, repaired clothing, and processed grain almost without pause. By evening, few people possessed the energy for complicated cooking. A thick stew. Fresh bread. Beer. Sometimes fish. That was enough. Enough for strength. Enough for another tomorrow. At midday, the heat settled heavily across the land once more. Flies buzzed lazily through workshops. Animals searched for shade beside walls and carts. The bright Egyptian sunlight reflected sharply from stone buildings until even breathing seemed slower and heavier. Workers paused whenever possible. Near a canal outside the village, several farmers rested beneath a narrow strip of shade cast by a sycamore tree. Sweat darkened their linen garments. Their feet and hands carried traces of wet soil from the morning's labor. One man opened a small basket lined with cloth. Inside rested pieces of coarse bread and sliced onions. Another worker shared dried fish wrapped carefully in reeds. The meal looked plain, but the men ate with quiet satisfaction. Hunger sharpened appreciation for ordinary food. Beneath the exhausting heat, even simple bread tasted deeply comforting. One farmer laughed softly while chewing. He joked that he had probably eaten onions every day since childhood. The others smiled tiredly. Most likely, they had too. Certain foods became inseparable from Egyptian identity itself. Onions, garlic, bread, beer, lentils. These were not occasional dishes. They formed the steady foundation beneath daily survival. And unlike wealthy feasts described in temple paintings or noble tombs, these meals belonged to real ordinary life. The meals of workers. The meals of boatmen. The meals of women kneeling beside ovens before dawn. The meals of tired children asleep beside cooking fires. In the crowded cities farther north, food preparation became even more important because so many mouths required feeding every single day. Bakers worked in hot conditions from morning until night. Large ovens radiated intense heat while laborers hauled sacks of grain through dusty streets. Bread production itself demanded constant effort. Grain had to be harvested, transported, stored, ground into flour, mixed with water, kneaded, shaped, baked, distributed. The entire system depended on endless repetition carried out by ordinary hands. Near one bakery courtyard, apprentices moved carefully around rows of rising dough while older bakers monitored the ovens. Sweat rolled down their faces despite the early hour. Ash floated through the air. The smell of warm bread filled the crowded space almost completely. Outside, customers waited patiently. Everyone needed bread. Without bread, Egyptian life could not continue. Even religious offerings often centered around familiar foods. Temples received bread, beer, onions, and grain as sacred gifts. The gods themselves were imagined receiving many of the same basic foods ordinary people consumed daily. This connection between divine ritual and ordinary meals made repetitive foods feel even more natural. Bread was not merely survival. Bread belonged to the structure of the world itself. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, long shadows stretched across fields and roads once again. Workers began returning home with weary movements beneath skies turning soft gold near the western desert. Dust clung to their sandals. Their shoulders ached. Their stomachs waited for supper already familiar in their imagination. Inside homes, cooking fires came alive again. Clay pots simmered. Water boiled. Fresh loaves cooled beside woven baskets. The evening meals often arrived with comforting predictability after difficult days. Families gathered close together inside small rooms where thick mud brick walls held back some of the remaining heat. Children leaned sleepily against parents. Fathers stretched sore backs. Mothers distributed portions carefully so supplies would last. The conversations remained simple. Who needed new sandals? Whether the river would flood well this season. Which neighbor had fallen ill? How much grain remained stored? Ordinary concerns beneath flickering oil lamps. Outside, the village gradually softened into darkness once more. The noise faded. The air cooled. The Nile reflected moonlight in long silver lines stretching through the night. In one quiet home, an old man sat alone for a few moments after supper while the rest of his family prepared for sleep. Before him rested the remains of a simple meal. Bread crusts. Lentils. A nearly empty cup of beer. Nothing luxurious. Nothing memorable to history. And yet this exact scene, repeated across countless homes for thousands of years, formed the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt far more than palaces or monuments ever could. History often remembers kings because kings leave behind statues and temples. But civilizations survive because ordinary people wake each morning and prepare breakfast. The old man finished the last piece of bread slowly while listening to the night insects outside. Tomorrow would likely resemble today very closely. He would wake before sunrise. Eat bread again. Walk the same dusty roads again. Labor beneath the same sun again. Return home exhausted again. And somehow there was peace inside that certainty. The oil lamp beside him flickered gently lower. Nearby, children already slept. Outside, cool night air drifted softly across the Nile Valley where thousands upon thousands of other families rested after another day nourished by the same humble meals. The stars above ancient Egypt remained patient and unmoving. And beneath them, ovens would soon warm once more before dawn arrived again beside the river. Before dawn touched the Nile Valley again, the darkness carried a heavy quietness over the land. The river moved slowly beneath the stars, black and smooth like polished stone. Along the banks, fishing boats rocked gently against wooden posts while reeds bent softly in the cool night wind. Most of Egypt still slept. Inside mud brick homes, families rested close together after another exhausting day beneath the heat. The smell of bread and smoke lingered faintly in the rooms, mixed with dust, lamp oil, and the scent of river water carried home in clay jars. Somewhere nearby, a baby stirred softly in sleep. A dog shifted against the ground outside. Then silence returned again. For many Egyptians, sleep itself was never very deep. Life demanded early rising, constant labor, and careful attention to supplies. Even during the night, people worried quietly about grain storage, river floods, illness, taxes, and harvests still far away. Food sat at the center of many of those worries. A family with enough grain could survive difficult seasons. A family without grain faced fear almost immediately. And because grain mattered so completely, meals became deeply tied to feelings of safety and stability. The same bread eaten every day was not merely habit. It was proof that life still continued as it should. In one village near the fertile floodplains, an older farmer awoke before the first hint of sunrise. His body ached from decades of labor. His knees hurt when he stood. His hands had become thick and rough from years spent working wet soil beneath the Egyptian sun. Still, he rose quietly. He stepped outside into the cool darkness while fastening a simple linen cloth around his waist. Above him, the stars looked pale and endless. He listened for a moment. The village remained mostly silent, though faint sounds of movement already drifted from nearby homes. Somewhere, a woman ground grain against stone. Somewhere else, wood cracked softly inside an oven fire being prepared for morning baking. The farmer smiled faintly. Egypt was waking again. He walked toward a small storage room attached to the side of his house. Inside stood baskets and jars holding the family's grain supply. He checked them carefully every morning almost without thinking. His father had done the same long ago. The grain looked safe. Dry. Untouched by insects. Enough for now. Only after seeing this did the farmer feel ready to begin the day. That small moment revealed something important about ancient Egyptian life. Before labor, before conversation, before even the morning meal itself, people often thought first about food security. Grain represented tomorrow. Grain represented survival. And survival depended heavily on repetition. Predictable harvests. Predictable storage. Predictable meals. The farmer's wife soon joined him outside carrying a clay bowl filled with dough prepared during the night. Together they worked beside the oven while the eastern sky slowly lightened behind distant palm trees. The smell of warming bread drifted outward into the cool dawn air. Nearby neighbors began stepping from their homes as well. Some carried tools toward the fields. Others balanced jars for water collection. Thin smoke rose gradually across the village rooftops while birds began calling from the reeds beside the Nile. Another ordinary day had begun. And with it came another ordinary meal. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. Beer poured from clay jars. Perhaps beans flavored with garlic. Maybe dates if the harvest had been kind recently. Nothing unexpected. Nothing extravagant. Yet these meals connected people deeply to both the land and each other. Children grew up recognizing familiar smells each morning. Bakers shaped dough using motions learned from parents and grandparents. Families organized entire days around the preparation and sharing of simple foods. In this way, meals became part of Egypt's emotional landscape. A child waking to the smell of bread understood that the household remained stable. A worker returning home to warm stew understood that another difficult day had ended safely. Food carried reassurance. As sunrise spread golden light across the Nile Valley, the roads filled slowly with movement. Donkeys hauled baskets through dusty paths. Farmers guided animals toward fields still damp from irrigation. Fishermen pushed boats into the river while mist hovered low above the water. Many carried food bundles wrapped carefully in cloth or reeds. The contents rarely changed very much. Bread, onions, fish, beans, These foods traveled easily beneath the heat and provided enough strength for long hours of labor. Near the riverbank, two young brothers prepared to spend the day helping their uncle repair fishing nets. Before leaving, their mother handed each boy a piece of flat bread and a small onion. The younger brother frowned slightly. Again. The older boy laughed softly. What else would there be? Their mother smiled tiredly while adjusting the cloth covering her hair. She had likely eaten similar meals since childhood herself. Her own mother had too. The boys accepted the food without further complaint because, in truth, they understood the reality of their world already. Fish came from the river. Grain came from the fields. Meals came from what could be grown, stored, and protected against spoilage. The desert surrounding Egypt allowed little room for luxury among ordinary people. As the sun climbed higher, the coolness of dawn disappeared quickly. Heat settled across roads and fields with familiar heaviness. Workers wiped sweat from their faces while continuing their tasks steadily beneath the bright sky. At a construction site near a temple complex, laborers hauled limestone blocks using ropes worn smooth by years of use. Dust coated their skin almost immediately. Overseers called instructions while the workers moved slowly but continuously through the heat. When midday arrived, the men rested briefly beside unfinished walls. One worker opened a woven basket and removed a loaf of coarse bread already hardened slightly from the morning air. Another passed around dried fish. A third shared garlic cloves wrapped inside cloth. They ate quietly. Not because the meal tasted extraordinary, but because hunger made simple food deeply satisfying after hard labor. One younger worker mentioned hearing stories about wealthy banquets held in noble houses farther north. Roasted ducks, honey cakes, sweet wine. The older men listened with little reaction. Such meals belonged to another world. Their own world depended on more practical things. Bread that lasted, beer that nourished, fish that could dry beneath the sun. Meals that asked little and gave enough. The conversation faded quickly as exhaustion settled back over the group. Nearby, sunlight reflected painfully from pale stone walls while hot wind carried dust through the work site. Eventually the men rose again. Ropes tightened. Muscles strained. Labor continued. Throughout Egypt, millions of people lived lives shaped by the same exhausting rhythm. They did not expect excitement from food. They expected endurance. Their meals became tools for survival as much as sources of comfort. Still, comfort existed there too. Inside one crowded household later that afternoon, a grandmother prepared lentil stew while several children rested sleepily nearby. The room smelled of garlic, herbs, and warm clay from the cooking pot. The grandmother moved slowly now because age had stiffened her joints, but her hands still remembered every motion perfectly. She stirred the stew while humming softly beneath her breath. The children watched her quietly. They knew this meal well. The thick stew would be eaten with bread torn by hand. The youngest child would likely fall asleep before finishing his portion. The older children would ask for more if enough remained. The grandmother remembered eating nearly identical meals as a little girl many decades earlier. At times, she wondered if anything truly changed at all beside the Nile. Kings changed. Officials changed. Temples grew larger. But ordinary life continued almost exactly the same. Morning bread. Evening stew. Long days beneath the sun. Cool nights beside the river. The repetition itself became part of Egyptian identity. Even travelers visiting from distant lands often noticed how organized Egyptian food systems appeared. Grain storage, bread production, and river farming all worked together in carefully maintained patterns. Egypt survived because its people mastered repetition. Without routine, the delicate balance between river, crops, labor, and survival could easily collapse. As evening approached once more, the harsh brightness softened across the valley. Golden sunlight stretched over irrigation canals and palm groves. Workers began returning home with slow, tired steps. The villages filled gradually with familiar evening sounds. Children calling to one another. Clay bowls clinking softly. Goats shifting in small pens. The crackling of cooking fires. And always, the smell of bread. Near one home, a young woman sat outside shaping dough while her husband repaired a broken farming tool beside her. Dust still covered his arms from the fields. Neither spoke very much. The day had taken most of their energy already. Still, the quiet felt peaceful rather than empty. The woman placed fresh loaves carefully into the oven while darkness gathered slowly across the village. Soon neighbors began eating supper inside nearby homes. Bread dipped into lentils. Beans mixed with herbs. Fish roasted lightly over flame. Beer poured slowly into clay cups. Again and again across Egypt, nearly the same meals appeared beneath flickering oil lamps. And perhaps that sameness brought people closer together. Shared food created shared understanding. Everyone knew the taste of coarse bread. Everyone recognized the smell of onions cooking beside lentils. Everyone understood the comfort of eating after a long day beneath the heat. Late into the evening, after supper ended and the village quieted once more, families prepared for sleep. Children curled together beneath linen cloths. Parents checked grain supplies one final time. The cooking fires burned lower. Outside, the Nile reflected pale moonlight through the darkness. An old fisherman sat alone near the riverbank for a few moments before bed. Beside him rested a small basket containing tomorrow's breakfast already prepared. Bread. Fish. Onions. The same familiar meal waiting for another familiar dawn. He looked out across the quiet river while cool wind touched his face gently. Somewhere far away, frogs croaked among the reeds. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. The ovens would glow again before sunrise. Grinding stones would turn slowly in dark kitchens. Workers would walk dusty roads toward fields and workshops. And ancient Egypt would continue once more, steady and patient beneath the stars, nourished by the same simple meals that had carried its people through countless quiet generations beside the Nile River. The night drifted quietly over the Nile Valley like a soft dark cloth spread gently across the land. The heat of the day had finally faded from the mud-brick walls, and cooler air moved slowly through narrow village streets where only a few lamps still burned. Most homes had already gone dark. Inside them, tired bodies rested after another long day of labor beneath the Egyptian sun. Workers slept with aching backs and rough hands curled loosely beside them. Children breathed softly beneath thin linen blankets while mothers and fathers rested nearby, already knowing that dawn would arrive far too soon. Outside, the Nile continued its endless movement through the darkness. The river never hurried. It flowed calmly beneath the moonlight just as it had for countless generations before these sleeping villages existed. Reeds along the shore bent gently whenever the breeze passed through them. Somewhere out on the water, a small fishing boat creaked softly against its rope. In ancient Egypt, even the night seemed to follow familiar routines. And so did hunger. Before sunrise each morning, stomachs would begin to empty again. Workers would wake already thinking about bread waiting beside the oven or beer stored in clay jars. Mothers would begin grinding grain while the stars still lingered overhead. Bakers would prepare fires in silence while the villages remained wrapped in darkness. The cycle never truly stopped. In one crowded household near a canal outside Memphis, an elderly woman woke suddenly during the night. For a moment she listened to the quiet breathing around her. Her grandchildren slept close beside one another on woven mats. Near the doorway rested baskets holding onions, garlic, and precious grain supplies. The old woman sat up slowly. Her body carried the exhaustion of many years. She had spent most of her life preparing food, grinding grain, kneading dough, carrying water, stirring stews above smoking fires. Sometimes she wondered how many loaves of bread her hands had shaped across the decades. Thousands perhaps. Maybe tens of thousands. And nearly every loaf had been made from the same grains, prepared in the same ways, eaten beside the same river. Yet the work never felt meaningless to her. Because every meal fed someone she loved. Every loaf carried another person through another difficult day. Quietly, she rose and stepped outside into the cool night air. The village lay silent beneath pale moonlight. In the distance, the dark shape of palm trees swayed gently near the riverbank. Tomorrow's grain still needed grinding. Tomorrow's bread still needed baking. Even now, before dawn, her mind moved automatically toward the next meal waiting to be prepared. This constant attention to food shaped nearly every corner of Egyptian life. People did not simply eat meals. They organized entire days around obtaining, preparing, storing, protecting, and sharing food. And because so much effort went into these tasks, meals remained practical and repetitive by necessity. Complex recipes required time. Rare ingredients required wealth. But bread and lentils could feed entire households steadily through difficult seasons. As the darkest hours slowly passed, faint gray light eventually began spreading across the eastern horizon. Egypt stirred awake once more. The first sounds returned gradually. A donkey stamping against dry earth. A clay jar shifting beside a doorway. The scrape of grinding stones beginning another day's work. Smoke rising from ovens. One by one, the villages beside the Nile came alive again. Near a riverside home, a young mother sat beside a grinding stone while her infant slept nearby wrapped in linen cloth. Her older son still slept against the wall, though soon she would wake him to help carry water. The woman pushed grain steadily beneath the heavy stone roller. Forward. Back. Forward again. The motion required strength and patience. Tiny clouds of flour dust rose into the morning air while the first warm light entered the room. Beside her rested the family's breakfast. Simple bread from yesterday's baking. A bowl of beans. Wheat beer. The same familiar foods. Outside, workers already passed along the dusty road carrying farming tools across their shoulders. The air still felt pleasant for now, but everyone understood the heat would arrive quickly. Ancient Egyptians learned to begin difficult tasks early whenever possible. Fields had to be irrigated before midday. Fish had to be caught before the river grew too bright and hot. Bakers needed to finish much of their work before the ovens became unbearable beside the afternoon heat. And people needed food before labor drained their strength completely. The young mother woke her son gently. The boy rubbed his eyes and immediately reached for bread without needing to ask what breakfast would be. He already knew. Most Egyptian children grew up inside powerful routines that changed very little over time. Certain smells marked certain hours of the day. Morning smelled like warm bread, smoke, and river air. Evening smelled like lentils, oil lamps, and cooling dust after sunset. The boy ate sleepily while listening to the village awakening outside. Men speaking softly in the road. Animals shifting in their pens. Birds calling from the reeds. Soon he would carry water jars beside his mother before the heat grew stronger. His day had already begun in almost exactly the same way hundreds of mornings before. At the edge of the village, fishermen prepared small boats beside the riverbank while pale sunlight spread across the Nile water. Their breakfasts remained modest and practical. Bread wrapped in cloth. Fish left from yesterday's catch. Sometimes onions. Always enough to keep working. One fisherman sat alone briefly before launching his boat. He tore bread carefully into smaller pieces while watching mist drift low across the water. The river looked calm this morning. Silver light rippled softly across its surface while distant birds circled above the marshes. Moments like this felt peaceful enough to make repetitive life seem almost beautiful. The fisherman did not crave endless variety. He craved stability. Good catches. Healthy children. Full grain baskets. A quiet evening meal after sunset. Simple hopes beside a simple river. As the morning brightened fully, heat began rising from the ground once again. Workers moved steadily through fields and workshops while sunlight reflected sharply from stone walls and dusty roads. At a large farming estate farther south, laborers harvested grain carefully beneath the growing sun. Bronze sickles flashed through tall stalks while bundles were gathered into piles for transport. Harvest season brought enormous relief whenever crops proved successful. Good harvests meant fuller granaries. Fuller granaries meant safer winters. And safer winters meant families could continue eating their familiar meals without fear. The laborers paused briefly during mid-morning to rest and eat. One woman passed around pieces of bread while another shared dates from a small woven basket. The dates tasted sweet and soft against mouths used mostly to coarse grains and onions. Small moments of sweetness mattered deeply in such lives. Still, the meal remained simple overall. Nobody expected luxury in the fields. The workers ate sitting directly on the ground beneath narrow strips of shade while hot wind moved through the harvested stalks around them. One older laborer spoke quietly about the previous flood season. Too much water in some places. Too little in others. Everyone listened carefully because flood discussions were really discussions about food. The Nile decided hunger or comfort long before bread reached the table. If the floods failed, meals became smaller. If crops weakened, grain had to stretch farther. If grain disappeared entirely, fear spread quickly through entire communities. Perhaps this constant awareness of uncertainty explains why Egyptians valued dependable foods so strongly. Familiar meals represented order in a world that could sometimes feel fragile. By midday, the heat grew heavy and exhausting again. The air shimmered above roads and irrigation canals. Workers wiped sweat constantly from their eyes while continuing their labor. In the crowded kitchens of a noble estate, servants moved carefully between ovens and storage rooms preparing food for a wealthy household. Here there existed more variety than ordinary villagers usually experienced. Roasted birds. Fresh fruit. Honey. Herbs. Wine. Yet even among the wealthy, bread remained central. Large baskets of loaves stood stacked beside tables while servants carried beer and grain supplies through the busy kitchens. Egypt itself rested upon bread no matter how rich or poor someone became. Far away from noble estates, ordinary villagers continued their own quieter food routines through the afternoon. A grandmother stirred lentils slowly over a fire. Children shelled beans beside a doorway. A farmer's wife repaired grain sacks while waiting for bread to finish baking. Everywhere, familiar tasks repeated endlessly. And perhaps repetition itself became comforting because it gave shape to time. Without clocks or modern schedules, people measured days through routines instead. Morning grinding. Midday meals. Evening baking. Nightfall. sleep, then begin again. As sunset approached, golden light softened the harsh edges of the land once more. Workers returned home beneath dusty skies glowing orange near the western desert. The evening air felt easier to breathe now. Cooking fires appeared gradually across the villages. The smell of onions and warm grain drifted through the streets again. Families gathered inside homes lit softly by oil lamps while supper was prepared. In one small room, a father sat cross-legged beside his children while his wife poured thick lentil stew into clay bowls. Fresh bread rested nearby wrapped in cloth to keep warm. The youngest child smiled sleepily at the smell. The father tore bread carefully and dipped it into the stew before handing pieces to his children one by one. No grand feast waited here. Only a quiet meal after honest labor. And still, the room carried peace. Outside, darkness slowly covered the Nile Valley once more. Frogs croaked among reeds beside the river. Insects hummed softly beneath palm trees. The family finished eating while the oil lamp flickered lower. Tomorrow morning the same foods would likely appear again. The same bread. The same beans. The same onions. But tonight, beneath the calm Egyptian night, sameness did not feel dull. It felt safe. It felt steady. It felt like life continuing gently beside the river exactly as it should. The night air beside the Nile carried the smell of wet earth and cooling stone as Egypt settled once more into darkness. Far beyond the villages, the desert rested beneath pale moonlight, silent and endless. Closer to the river, reeds whispered softly in the breeze while narrow canals reflected small trembling lights from the last oil lamps still burning inside homes. The day's heat had finally loosened its hold. Workers who had spent long hours in the fields now slept deeply beside their families. Their muscles ached beneath thin linen coverings. Dust still clung faintly to their sandals left near doorways. Inside many homes, the remains of supper rested quietly in clay bowls beside the walls. Bread crusts. A little lentil stew. Perhaps fish bones from the evening meal. Simple traces of ordinary lives. For most Egyptians, food was never far from thought. Even in sleep, tomorrow's labor waited just beyond the darkness, and tomorrow's labor required strength. Strength came from grain, from bread, from the familiar meals repeated steadily across generations beside the Nile. Near one small riverside village, an old fisherman remained awake later than most. He sat alone outside his home repairing a torn net beneath the weak glow of an oil lamp. His hands moved slowly now with age, though years of repetition allowed him to work almost without looking. Thread through rope. Pull tight. Tie carefully. Repeat. Beside him rested a small basket holding tomorrow morning's food already prepared. A loaf of coarse bread. A few onions. Dried fish wrapped in cloth. Enough for another long day on the river. The old fisherman looked out toward the dark water for a moment. The Nile reflected moonlight in soft silver lines stretching quietly into the distance. Somewhere farther downstream, another boat moved slowly through the night. He remembered his father sitting exactly this way many years earlier. The same river. The same net repairs. The same meals waiting beside tired hands. Life in Egypt often moved so slowly that generations seemed to blend together like flowing water. Children inherited not only tools and homes, but habits. Recipes. Work rhythms. Expectations about what life should feel like. And life felt repetitive because survival depended on repetition. The old fisherman finally extinguished the lamp and lay down to sleep beside the quiet sounds of the river. Before dawn arrived, Egypt would awaken again. It always did. In the deepest hours before sunrise, the villages remained wrapped in soft darkness. Cool air drifted through narrow alleys lined with mud brick walls cracked gently by years of heat and wind. Dogs slept curled beneath wooden carts. Palm leaves rustled quietly overhead. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the first movements of morning began. A woman stepped outside carrying kindling for the oven. A farmer coughed softly while preparing tools. Grinding stones scraped against grain inside dark kitchens. Tiny sparks rose from cooking fires. The long cycle continued once more. Inside one crowded home near the edge of a farming settlement, a young boy woke to the smell of bread warming beside the fire. He blinked sleepily while pale dawnlight entered through the reed-covered window. His mother knelt beside the oven turning flat loaves carefully with practiced hands. Sweat already glistened lightly on her forehead from the heat of the fire even though the morning remained cool outside. The boy sat quietly for a moment watching her. Every morning looked almost the same. The same clay oven glowing orange. The same baskets of grain against the wall. The same clay cups waiting for beer. The same smell of smoke and warm flour filling the room. Yet the familiarity comforted him. Children in ancient Egypt learned stability through repetition. Familiar meals told them the household remained safe. As long as bread continued appearing each morning, life still held together. The mother handed the boy a piece of warm bread while his father prepared for work nearby. Today the father would help clear irrigation channels before the next watering cycle. The work would be slow and exhausting beneath the growing heat. Mud would cling heavily to his legs. His back would ache by midday. He needed food that filled the stomach and lasted through labor. And so breakfast remained practical. Bread. Beer. Beans left from yesterday evening. Nothing more. The family ate quietly while sunrise spread across the Nile Valley outside. Golden light touched the tops of palm trees and reflected brightly across irrigation canals. Soon the roads filled with movement again. Workers carrying tools. Women balancing water jars. Children chasing one another through dust. Donkeys pulling carts loaded with grain sacks. The rhythm of Egypt returning with the daylight. Near a large granary outside the village, laborers began unloading baskets of harvested grain from boats arriving along the river. Dust filled the air around them while scribes recorded quantities carefully onto papyrus sheets. Grain storage demanded constant attention. Too much moisture ruined supplies. Rats threatened entire harvests. Poor organization could leave villages hungry before the next flood season arrived. The workers moved steadily despite the rising heat because everyone understood the importance of protecting food reserves. Bread eaten months later often depended on labor completed today. One younger laborer paused briefly to wipe sweat from his face. He watched older workers nearby chewing onions while continuing their tasks almost without rest. The younger man laughed softly. He wondered aloud whether Egyptians would ever tire of onions. An older worker shrugged. "Onions survive heat well," he replied. That was reason enough. Practical thinking shaped nearly every part of Egyptian eating habits. Foods remained popular because they lasted, nourished, traveled easily, or grew reliably beside the Nile. People valued dependability more than novelty. At the riverbank farther downstream, fishermen returned with early catches while market sellers prepared stalls beneath woven shades. The smell of fish mixed with river mud, smoke, herbs, and warm dust already rising beneath the morning sun. Women arranged onions and garlic into neat piles. Bread sellers carried baskets balanced carefully atop their heads. A brewer rolled heavy jars into place while flies buzzed lazily through the warming air. The market contained movement and noise, yet beneath it all rested familiar routines repeated almost exactly each day. The same goods arrived. The same foods sold. The same meals prepared inside homes afterward. Even bargaining followed patterns people knew by heart. Near one bread stall, a woman exchanged part of her household grain supply for several fresh loaves. She inspected the bread carefully before wrapping it inside cloth. The loaves looked much like the bread her mother once bought. Dark, dense, slightly rough from stone ground flour. Perfectly ordinary. And perfectly necessary. As the sun climbed higher, heat spread heavily across the valley once more. Workers in fields and workshops slowed their movements to conserve strength. The bright Egyptian sky appeared almost white above the desert edges. At a stone-cutting site near a temple construction area, laborers rested briefly beneath narrow strips of shade cast by unfinished walls. Their midday meal waited nearby in baskets and cloth wrappings. Bread hardened by the dry air. Garlic. Beans. Dried fish. The men ate sitting directly on the dusty ground. One worker closed his eyes while chewing slowly, grateful simply to rest for a few moments. Sweat cooled against his skin beneath the shade while hot wind carried traces of stone dust through the air. No one expected luxury here. Food existed to support labor. Still, certain small pleasures remained important. Warm bread fresh from morning ovens. Sweet dates during harvest season. Cool water after hours beneath the sun. The smell of stew waiting at home after dark. These simple comforts helped carry ordinary people through difficult lives. Inside village homes during the hottest hours, cooking continued quietly despite the heat. Women stirred clay pots while children rested nearby. The smell of lentils and onions drifted through dim rooms where sunlight entered only in narrow beams through windows and doorways. A grandmother sat near one doorway peeling garlic slowly while telling stories to two sleepy grandchildren. Beside her, dough rested beneath cloth waiting for evening baking. The children listened while half asleep from the heavy afternoon warmth. Outside, even animals moved slowly now. Goats rested in shade. Dogs stretched beneath carts. Birds gathered near water where the air felt slightly cooler. Everything in Egypt adapted itself to the rhythm of heat. And meals adapted too. Large heavy feasts belonged mostly to festivals because ordinary days demanded simpler foods easier to prepare and digest beneath the climate. Bread and beans could sustain labor without exhausting already tired bodies. As evening finally approached, relief spread quietly through the villages. Shadows lengthened across roads and fields. Workers began returning home beneath skies turning soft gold and deep orange. The smell of evening fires appeared again. Families gathered. Children washed dust from their feet. Clay bowls were prepared. Near one small home, a tired farmer sat outside while his wife baked fresh bread nearby. Their youngest daughter leaned sleepily against his shoulder while watching sparks rise into the evening air. The farmer's stomach already anticipated supper. He knew exactly what it would taste like. Lentils. Warm bread. Beer. Perhaps onions roasted lightly beside the fire. The familiar expectation itself felt comforting after a difficult day. When supper finally arrived, the family ate slowly together beneath the fading light. Nearby neighbors did the same inside dozens of similar homes spread across the village. Thousands of ordinary meals unfolding quietly beside the Nile. No music. No ceremony. Only tired people nourishing themselves before sleep. And perhaps that was the real story of ancient Egypt more than anything carved into temple walls. Not kings. Not battles. Not gold. But ordinary people waking before dawn each day to prepare bread for the ones they loved. Night deepened slowly once more across the valley. The cooking fires dimmed. The roads emptied. The Nile reflected the stars again. And inside quiet homes beside the river, families drifted gently into sleep after another day carried steadily forward by the same simple meals that had sustained Egypt for countless generations. The Nile moved quietly beneath the stars while Egypt slept once more beneath the warm night sky. Along the riverbanks, fishing boats drifted gently against their ropes, rocking softly with the current. Palm trees stood motionless in the darkness, their shadows stretching long across the sleeping villages. Inside the homes beside the river, oil lamps had mostly burned out. Only a few faint glows remained behind reed-covered windows where someone still worked late into the night. Perhaps a mother finishing tomorrow's dough. Perhaps an old man repairing sandals. Perhaps a baker preparing grain before sleep finally claimed him. The villages smelled faintly of smoke, dust, and warm bread even now. These smells never truly disappeared from Egyptian life. They settled into clothing, walls, baskets, and hair. A child growing up beside the Nile learned the scent of grain almost as naturally as the scent of river water or wet earth after flood season. Food surrounded life constantly because life itself depended upon careful preparation. In one small house near the edge of a farming community, a young woman sat alone beside a grinding stone while the rest of her family slept nearby. The room remained dim except for the weak orange glow of a small oil lamp beside her knee. Her hands moved slowly through the grain. Push. Turn. Gather. Repeat. The sound filled the quiet room gently. Grinding grain required endless patience. Every loaf of bread began here, beneath tired hands working late or rising early. Most Egyptians probably spent far more hours preparing food than modern people could easily imagine. And because the work consumed so much time and energy, meals stayed simple. Complicated dishes belonged mostly to festivals or wealthy households with servants. Ordinary families relied on foods that could be made steadily, repeatedly, and in large amounts without wasting precious resources. The woman paused for a moment and stretched her sore fingers. Tomorrow would bring another full day. Water to carry. Bread to bake. Children to feed. Clothing to wash. And through all those tasks, meals would quietly shape the rhythm of the household from morning until night. Outside, the first cool breeze before dawn drifted across the village. The night was beginning to change. Soon the sky would brighten again over ancient Egypt. Farther downriver, near a larger town crowded with workshops and narrow streets, bakers were already preparing ovens while most people still slept. The bakery courtyard glowed faintly beneath firelight while workers carried sacks of grain through drifting clouds of flour dust. The heat near the ovens grew intense even before sunrise. One baker wiped sweat from his forehead while shaping rows of dough onto flat trays. He had done this work since childhood. His father had taught him how to judge the dough by touch alone, how to read the heat of the oven by the color of the clay walls inside. The work rarely changed. Neither did the bread. Yet people lined up every morning waiting for it. Workers needed breakfast before dawn labor. Children needed food before chores. Boatmen carried bread onto the river. Farmers packed bread into cloth wrappings before walking toward the fields. Bread followed Egyptians everywhere. Near the bakery entrance, an older laborer arrived while the sky still held traces of stars overhead. He exchanged grain for several fresh loaves and tucked them carefully into a basket beneath his arm. The smell rising from the warm bread made him smile faintly. Simple pleasures mattered deeply in hard lives. As he walked home through the quiet streets, he passed other early workers beginning their own routines. Water carriers moved silently toward the river. Potters prepared clay beside workshop doors. A brewer rolled heavy jars across the ground while muttering sleepily to himself. The town awakened slowly and predictably. Almost every person moving through those dim streets had likely eaten very similar meals the previous day. And the day before that. The repetition connected them all together. Inside homes across Egypt, families gathered for breakfast while sunrise spread gold across the Nile Valley. Children sat cross-legged on floors while parents distributed pieces of bread and bowls of beans. The meals remained humble. But hunger sharpened appreciation. A warm loaf in the cool morning hours could feel deeply comforting before a long day of labor beneath the sun. Near one irrigation canal, a father and his two sons prepared to spend the morning clearing mud and debris from the water channels feeding nearby fields. The work would require standing for hours in wet soil beneath growing heat. Before leaving, the boy's mother handed them bread and onions wrapped inside cloth. The younger son asked if there might be fish tonight. Maybe, the mother answered softly. If the river is kind. That answer carried the quiet truth behind many Egyptian meals. People ate what the land and river allowed. Nothing more could be guaranteed. The Nile provided life, but life still demanded effort. The father and sons walked together through fields still damp from irrigation. Morning birds moved low above the crops while sunlight slowly brightened the water flowing through the canals. The boys ate while walking. Bread first. Then small bites of onion. The father carried beer in a clay jar slung carefully over his shoulder. Ahead of them waited another long day. As the morning advanced, heat settled steadily across the valley once again. Workers bent over fields while sweat darkened their linen clothing. Flies drifted lazily through the warm air. Dust rose beneath sandals along crowded roads. At the edge of a construction site near Thebes, laborers hauled heavy stone blocks toward an unfinished wall. Overseers shouted instructions while ropes tightened against straining shoulders. The men paused briefly near midday. One worker sat heavily against a stone and opened his food wrapping. Bread. Garlic. Beans. Always the same. Yet after hours beneath the brutal sun, the sight of familiar food brought relief rather than disappointment. The worker chewed slowly while staring out across the bright landscape shimmering beneath heat. In the distance, the Nile cut a green path through the dry world around it. Without the river, none of this would exist. No grain. No bread. No villages. No Egypt. Perhaps this understanding made ordinary meals feel sacred in quiet ways. Every loaf represented successful floods, healthy fields, careful storage, and the labor of many hands. Even simple food carried the weight of survival. Inside the cooler shadows of village homes, women prepared afternoon meals while children rested nearby. Clay pots simmered gently over low fires. The smell of lentils mixed with onions and herbs drifted through dim rooms where sunlight entered in narrow golden beams. A grandmother sat weaving reed baskets while watching stew bubble slowly nearby. Her granddaughter peeled garlic beside her with small careful fingers. The old woman smiled softly. She remembered doing the same task beside her own grandmother many years earlier. Generations passed quietly in Egypt. Not through dramatic moments, but through repeated ordinary routines shared between parents and children. How to knead dough. How to dry fish. How to store grain safely. How to stretch lentils through difficult seasons. These small lessons kept communities alive far more than grand speeches or royal ceremonies. Outside, the hottest part of the afternoon settled heavily across the land. Even the wind felt warm now. Workers slowed their movements wherever possible while animals searched for shade beneath trees and walls. In one small marketplace, Merchants sprinkled water lightly over vegetables to keep them from drying too quickly beneath the heat. Bread sellers shaded their baskets with cloth. Fishmongers worked quickly before spoilage began. Food required constant attention in the Egyptian climate. Perhaps that was another reason meals remained repetitive. People trusted foods they understood well. Foods that stored safely. Foods that survived transport. Foods that could endure heat and time. Novelty carried risk. Routine carried security. As evening approached once more, relief spread slowly through the villages beside the Nile. Shadows stretched long across the roads. Workers returned home exhausted, their sandals coated in dust and mud. The smell of fresh bread appeared again from glowing ovens. Children ran through narrow streets while mothers called them home for supper. Inside one quiet house, a fisherman sat beside his family while his wife prepared roasted fish over a small fire. Tonight the catch had been good. The children smiled at the smell. Even small changes in the meal brought gentle excitement after so much repetition. Still, bread remained at the center of the table. Always bread. The fisherman tore pieces carefully and dipped them into lentil stew while speaking softly about the river conditions that morning. His eldest son listened closely, hoping one day to manage his own fishing boat. Outside, darkness gathered gradually over the Nile Valley. Oil lamps flickered behind windows. Cooking fires burned lower. The noise of labor faded into soft evening quiet. After supper, the family sat together for a little while beneath the cooling night air. The youngest child fell asleep against his mother's shoulder while distant frogs croaked among the reeds beside the river. Tomorrow would likely look much the same. The same roads. The same labor. The same bread baking before dawn. Yet beneath the stars of ancient Egypt, repetition did not always feel empty. Sometimes it felt peaceful. Sometimes it felt like belonging. And sometimes, beside the slow endless river, the same humble meal shared with familiar hands was enough to make the world feel steady and safe for one more quiet night. Long after the final cooking fires dimmed beside the Nile, the warmth of the day still lingered inside the mud-brick walls of Egyptian homes. Families slept beneath thin linen cloths while the night breeze drifted gently through narrow windows covered with woven reeds. Outside, the river moved slowly through the darkness. Moonlight rested softly on the water, turning the Nile into a pale silver ribbon stretching north through the sleeping land. The reeds along the shore swayed with quiet patience, and somewhere far away, an oar dipped gently into the water before disappearing again into silence. Egypt rested. But even in rest, the routines of life waited quietly for morning. Tomorrow's grain already sat prepared in baskets. Tomorrow's dough would soon be kneaded. Tomorrow's meals were already imagined before the next sunrise arrived. In one small riverside home, a father stirred awake during the deepest hours before dawn. For a moment he listened to the soft breathing of his children nearby. The room smelled faintly of ashes from the evening fire and the warm grain scent of bread wrapped carefully in cloth beside the wall. He sat up slowly. His body ached from hauling irrigation stones the day before. His shoulders felt heavy even after sleep. Yet he knew he would rise again soon and return to the canals because the fields depended on water, and the family depended on the fields. The connection between labor and food remained constant in Egypt. Every meal carried the memory of work behind it. Bread meant someone planted grain. Someone harvested it. Someone carried heavy sacks beneath the sun. Someone ground flour for hours beside a stone. Someone baked before dawn while the village still slept. Food was never simple in the sense of effort. Only in ingredients. The father stepped quietly outside into the cool darkness. The village remained still, though faint signs of waking life had already begun to appear. A baker's oven glowed dimly nearby. A woman swept dust from a doorway. A donkey shifted beside a wooden cart. Soon the whole settlement would awaken again. The father walked toward the river carrying empty jars. The path beneath his sandals felt cool and smooth from countless footsteps worn into the earth over generations. Above him, the stars faded slowly as the eastern horizon softened toward gray. At the water's edge, he knelt and filled the jars carefully. The Nile smelled of wet earth and reeds. Gentle ripples touched the muddy bank. Birds had not yet begun their morning calls. For a few moments, the world felt completely calm. Perhaps this was another reason Egyptian life accepted repetition so naturally. The land itself repeated beauty every day. The same sunrise over the river. The same cool air before dawn. The same evening shadows stretching across the fields. People found peace inside familiar things. Back at the house, the father's wife had already begun preparing breakfast. She moved quietly beside the oven while their youngest daughter still slept curled near the wall. The meal waiting for them looked much like yesterday's. Warm bread. Beans. A little beer. Perhaps a few dates saved carefully from market day. The family sat together while dawn slowly brightened the room. Nobody complained about the food. There was comfort in beginning the morning with familiar tastes before facing another difficult day. Outside, Egypt awakened steadily beneath the growing sunlight. Workers filled the roads. Farmers led animals toward the fields. Boats drifted onto the Nile carrying fishermen and cargo alike. The smell of bread spread through the villages once more. Near a crowded workshop district farther north, stone carvers began their labor early before the full heat settled over the city. Chips of limestone scattered across the ground while hammers echoed softly between unfinished walls. During a brief pause, one young apprentice sat beside an older worker and shared bread from a woven basket. The apprentice chewed thoughtfully. "Do you ever wish for different food?" he asked quietly. The older worker wiped sweat from his forehead before answering. "Different food does not make the stone lighter," he said. The apprentice smiled faintly. Then both returned to eating. Their meal was plain, but it filled empty stomachs and restored enough strength to continue working. In many ways, that was all Egyptian workers truly demanded from food. Strength. Stability. Enough. By mid-morning, the heat grew stronger across the valley. Sunlight reflected harshly from pale stone buildings while dust rose beneath sandals moving through crowded roads. At a riverside market, merchants called softly to passing customers beneath woven shade coverings. Bread sellers displayed dark loaves stacked high inside baskets. Fishmongers cleaned fresh catches beside wooden tables while flies buzzed lazily through the warm air. A woman carrying a child stopped beside a grain seller and examined barley carefully with practiced eyes. Good grain mattered deeply. Poor grain meant poor bread. Poor bread meant weaker bodies. Everything connected together. Nearby, a brewer rolled large clay jars into the shade while workers carried water from the river. Beer production required enormous amounts of grain as well, and beer remained central to Egyptian diets across every social class. Children drank weaker forms. Laborers drank it during work. Families served it beside nearly every meal. Thick Egyptian beer nourished as much as it refreshed. Like bread, it became part of life itself. Farther south, along narrow irrigation channels beside green fields, farmers bent low beneath the growing heat while clearing weeds and guiding water carefully toward crops. Their movements appeared slow and patient. Egyptian farming required attention rather than speed. The Nile decided the rhythm. The workers paused beneath a sycamore tree for their midday meal. One man opened a cloth bundle revealing bread, garlic, and salted fish. Another passed around onions. The group ate quietly while hot wind moved through the fields around them. Sweat cooled slowly against tired skin beneath the shade. One younger farmer spoke about hearing stories of foreign lands where different spices and fruits could be found. An older farmer listened before shrugging softly. "The Nile gives what we need," he replied. The others nodded. That simple belief rested beneath much of Egyptian eating culture. Food was not meant to entertain endlessly. Food was meant to sustain life in harmony with the river and the seasons. And for thousands of years, it succeeded. Inside village homes during the afternoon, women continued their endless quiet labor around food preparation. Grain had to be sorted. Dough had to rise. Lentils needed cleaning. Clay ovens required tending. A grandmother sat beside her granddaughter teaching her how to judge flour by touch alone. "Too dry," the old woman murmured softly. "Add water slowly." The child obeyed carefully while warm sunlight entered the room through the doorway. These lessons passed quietly from one generation to another without ceremony. Yet they shaped Egyptian civilization more deeply than many royal decrees ever did. Without skilled hands preparing daily meals, entire communities would weaken quickly. As afternoon drifted toward evening, shadows lengthened once again across the Nile Valley. Workers returned home slowly along dusty roads while the fierce heat finally began to ease. Children ran beside irrigation canals laughing softly. Goats bleated from small pens. The smell of evening cooking fires returned to the air. Inside one modest home, a pot of lentil stew simmered gently while bread baked beside glowing coals. A fisherman cleaned his nets outside while his wife prepared supper. Tonight there would also be fresh fish. The catch had been kind again. Their oldest son smiled when he saw the fish because even small changes brought excitement to repetitive diets. Yet nobody viewed the familiar foods with resentment. Bread still formed the center of the meal. Bread always did. The family gathered together after sunset while oil lamps flickered softly against the walls. The father divided fish carefully so everyone received enough. The youngest child dipped bread eagerly into the stew while listening sleepily to the quiet conversation around him. Outside, the village gradually softened into night once more. The roads emptied. The heat faded. The Nile reflected the first stars appearing overhead. After supper, the family sat outside for a while beneath the cooler evening air. Nearby neighbors did the same. Soft voices drifted through the darkness while insects hummed beside the reeds. No grand entertainment filled these evenings. Only rest. Only quiet companionship after labor. Only the steady comfort of familiar people and familiar meals beneath the ancient sky. Later, when the lamps were extinguished and the village finally grew silent again, the smell of baked grain still lingered faintly in the night air. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise touched the Nile once more, ovens would warm again. Grinding stones would begin turning. Workers would reach for bread with tired hands. And ancient Egypt would continue gently onward, carried day after day by repetition, labor, river water, and the same simple meals shared quietly beside the endless Nile. The Nile drifted beneath the night sky with the same calm patience it had carried for thousands of years. Moonlight shimmered across the dark water while cool air moved slowly through the reeds lining the riverbanks. The villages beside the Nile had grown quiet once more, their narrow streets empty except for the occasional wandering dog or the soft footsteps of someone still awake late into the night. Inside the homes, families rested close together. Children slept with tired arms folded beneath their heads. Laborers stretched aching legs across woven mats after another day beneath the heavy Egyptian sun. Clay bowls from the evening meal sat stacked near walls waiting to be cleaned in the morning. And always nearby stood baskets or jars holding grain. The grain never rested far from sight. It represented tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's beer, tomorrow's survival. In many Egyptian homes, people probably looked toward their grain stores before sleep almost as naturally as they looked toward their children. Grain brought comfort because grain meant continuity. As long as the grain remained safe, life could continue repeating itself in familiar ways. In one quiet home near a canal outside a farming settlement, an elderly man remained awake while the rest of his family slept. He sat beside the doorway watching the night sky while chewing slowly on a small piece of leftover bread from supper. The bread had hardened slightly in the cool air. Still, he ate carefully and gratefully. Waste belonged to dangerous times. The old man had lived through poor flood seasons before. He remembered years when the Nile waters failed to rise high enough, when crops weakened beneath the harsh sun, and when families watched grain stores shrink with growing fear. During those years, meals became smaller. Bread grew thinner. Lentils stretched farther. People spoke more quietly around the supper fire. Perhaps that memory explained why Egyptians valued simple dependable food so deeply. Familiar meals did not merely fill hunger. They reassured people that order still existed. The old man finally lay down to sleep while outside the Nile flowed endlessly onward through the darkness. Soon dawn would arrive again. And with it would come the smell of warm bread rising once more across the valley. Before sunrise, the world held a brief and peaceful stillness. The air felt cool against the skin. The stars faded slowly above the eastern horizon while faint gray light spread gently over the fields and canals. Then Egypt began waking again. A baker opened his oven and checked the coals. A woman carried water jars toward the river. A farmer lifted tools onto his shoulder. Grinding stones scraped softly inside dim kitchens. The sound of grain being prepared before dawn had echoed across Egypt for countless generations. Slow grinding. Steady grinding. Patient grinding. Every loaf demanded labor long before baking even began. Inside one crowded household near Thebes, a mother and daughter worked side by side beside a grinding stone while younger children still slept nearby. Flour dust clung lightly to their hands and arms. The daughter yawned sleepily. Her mother smiled gently. "You will wake fully after bread," she whispered. The daughter nodded because she knew it was true. Breakfast would come soon. Warm bread. Beans. Beer diluted with water. Perhaps garlic or onions if enough remained. The same foods again. Yet the daughter did not resent the repetition. These meals belonged to home. They belonged to safety. She could not imagine mornings without the smell of baking bread drifting through the cool dawn air. Outside, sunlight slowly touched the Nile Valley. Birds rose from the reeds. Palm trees cast long shadows across the damp earth. The roads filled gradually with workers beginning another day. Near a riverside dock, fishermen loaded nets and baskets onto small wooden boats while the morning mist still hovered above the water. One younger fisherman sat briefly on the edge of the dock eating breakfast before departure. He tore pieces from a flat loaf and dipped them into thick bean paste while watching the river brighten beneath the sunrise. Nearby, an older fisherman drank quietly from a clay cup of beer. Neither man spoke much. Morning carried a calm seriousness before the labor began. Soon they would spend hours beneath the heat pulling nets and rowing against the current. Their food needed to sustain strength steadily throughout the day. And so the meals remained simple and reliable. A rich noble might enjoy sweet cakes flavored with honey or roasted meats during feasts, but ordinary river workers depended mostly on foods that endured heat, travel, and long hours of physical exhaustion. Bread traveled well. Onions resisted spoilage. Dried fish lasted for days. Beer nourished and refreshed. The river shaped their labor, and the labor shaped their meals. As the sun climbed higher, villages and towns across Egypt filled with movement and noise. Merchants arranged goods beneath shaded market stalls while donkeys pulled heavy carts through dusty streets. The smell of baking grain drifted everywhere. Near one marketplace, a bread seller called softly to passing workers while arranging fresh loaves inside woven baskets. The bread appeared dark and coarse, marked with rough textures from stone-ground flour. A laborer stopped and purchased 2 loaves before heading toward a construction site nearby. He tucked the bread carefully beneath his arm. Already he imagined the midday rest when he would sit briefly in the shade and eat. Sometimes anticipation itself carried comfort through difficult work. At the construction site, teams of laborers hauled stone beneath the growing heat. Their sandals scraped across dusty ground while overseers shouted instructions over the sound of ropes straining against heavy loads. Sweat covered the workers quickly. The air smelled of limestone dust, hot stone, and human exhaustion. By midday, the men rested beneath narrow strips of shade cast by unfinished walls. Food bundles opened one by one. Bread, beans, onions, fish. The same simple combinations repeated again across countless work sites throughout Egypt. One younger worker laughed softly while chewing a piece of bread. "If I die," he joked quietly, "bury me with onions." The others smiled tiredly. Perhaps they understood the joke too well. Certain foods followed Egyptians through every stage of life because those foods remained so deeply connected to survival itself. Even in tomb paintings, loaves of bread and jars of beer appeared often among offerings prepared for the dead. The Egyptians imagined nourishment continuing beyond life because nourishment shaped life so completely. Far from the construction sites, the quieter rhythm of village homes continued through the hot afternoon hours. Women stirred stews over low fires while children rested nearby beneath the shade. A grandmother sat outside one doorway cleaning lentils carefully in a shallow basket. Tiny stones had to be removed before cooking. The work demanded attention despite its simplicity. Beside her, a little boy watched curiously. "Will we eat lentils tonight?" he asked. "Most likely," the grandmother answered with a soft smile. The boy nodded calmly. He seemed satisfied by the answer. Children raised beside the Nile learned early that meals followed patterns. Certain foods belonged to ordinary days. Other foods appeared only during celebrations or especially successful harvests. Routine shaped expectation. And expectation shaped comfort. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, relief spread gently across the valley once more. The fierce brightness faded from the sky while cooler air drifted from the river. Workers returned home along dusty roads. The smell of cooking fires rose again. Goats bleated softly from their pens while children ran barefoot through the narrow streets before supper. Inside homes, families prepared evening meals much as they had the night before. Lentil stew bubbling slowly inside clay pots. Fresh bread warming beside coals. Fish roasting over open flame. Beer poured carefully into cups. Near one modest house beside a canal, a mother divided bread among her children while her husband washed dust from his arms outside. The youngest daughter asked whether tomorrow's meal would also include lentils. "Probably," the mother answered gently. The little girl smiled sleepily. "Good." The answer revealed something quiet and important about Egyptian life. Familiar food often brought reassurance rather than boredom. In a world filled with uncertainty about floods, illness, harvests, and labor, sameness could feel deeply calming. After supper, the family sat outside together beneath the cooling sky. Nearby neighbors did the same while the last light faded behind the western desert. The Nile reflected soft purple and silver colors beneath the rising moon. An old man played quietly with a child beside the road. Women spoke softly while repairing clothing. A fisherman cleaned nets beneath lamplight. The evening carried no hurry now. Only rest. Only tired people slowly relaxing after another long day supported by familiar meals and familiar routines. Later, when darkness fully covered the villages again, the smells of warm grain and cooking smoke lingered gently in the air. Inside the homes, bread for tomorrow already rested wrapped carefully in cloth. And beneath the stars of ancient Egypt, countless families drifted once more into sleep beside the river, comforted by the simple knowledge that morning would return with bread, labor, sunlight, and another quiet day shaped by the same humble meals that had sustained life along the Nile for generations beyond memory. The Nile breathed softly through the darkness while Egypt slept beneath a sky filled with pale drifting stars. The riverbanks rested in silence except for the gentle movement of water against mud and reeds. Far across the western desert, the sand held the warmth of the day a little longer, though cooler air now drifted slowly into the villages beside the river. Inside the homes, the smell of evening meals still lingered faintly. Warm grain, lentils, smoke from cooking fires, fish roasted over open flame. These smells wrapped themselves into Egyptian life so completely that people likely stopped noticing them most of the time. A child born beside the Nile grew up surrounded by the scent of bread just as naturally as the sound of river water or the sight of palm trees bending in the wind. In one small home near a field of barley, a young mother lay awake while her children slept nearby. The room had grown quiet except for breathing and the distant hum of insects outside. Beside the wall stood several baskets of grain covered carefully with cloth. The mother looked toward them before closing her eyes. Not because she admired them, but because her mind always returned to food supplies before sleep. How much grain remained? Whether the next flood would be strong enough? Whether the bread would last through the coming weeks? These thoughts followed many Egyptians quietly through life. People living beside the Nile understood that comfort could disappear quickly when food became uncertain. And because of that understanding, familiar meals carried emotional weight beyond simple hunger. A bowl of lentils meant safety. Fresh bread meant tomorrow remained possible. Even plain onions beside a loaf could feel reassuring after difficult labor. The mother finally drifted to sleep while outside the Nile continued its endless movement through the night. Hours later, before dawn had fully arrived, Egypt slowly began waking once again. At first the changes were small. A door opening softly. The scrape of sandals against packed earth. The crackle of kindling catching fire. Then more sounds joined gradually. Grinding stones turning. Animals stirring. Voices murmuring in sleepy conversation. The eastern sky brightened little by little above the palm trees. Another day had begun beside the river. Near a bakery courtyard in a crowded town farther north, workers moved quickly through warm clouds of flour while ovens glowed orange in the dim early light. The heat from the clay ovens spread heavily through the air even before sunrise. One baker shaped loaves with practiced hands while another stacked finished bread into baskets for morning customers. Their work required speed now. Soon laborers, farmers, boatmen, and servants would arrive looking for food before beginning their own long days. The bakers understood that much of Egypt depended on these ordinary loaves. Bread paid workers. Bread traveled with fishermen. Bread filled the stomachs of children before chores. Bread waited beside nearly every Egyptian meal, no matter how rich or poor the household might be. The bakers themselves had eaten bread before beginning work that morning. Likely they would eat it again before the day ended. Repetition shaped even the lives of those producing the food. As sunrise spread golden light across the Nile Valley, workers poured steadily into roads and marketplaces. Dust rose beneath sandals while donkeys pulled heavy carts loaded with grain sacks and clay jars. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared nets while swallowing quick breakfasts of bread dipped into beer. One older fisherman sat quietly beside his son, watching the water brighten beneath the growing sunlight. The boy chewed slowly and asked why they never grew tired of bread. The father thought for a moment before answering. "Because hunger returns every day," he said softly. The boy nodded. It seemed simple enough. And perhaps that answer explained much about ancient Egyptian eating habits. People did not expect meals to constantly surprise them. Hunger itself repeated daily, and so meals repeated too. The body demanded nourishment. The land provided certain dependable foods. Life organized itself around that reality. Soon the fishermen pushed their boats into the river while morning mist still hovered low above the water. Their baskets carried the same practical supplies as always. Bread wrapped in cloth. Onions. Dried fish. Beer stored carefully in clay jars. Enough to endure long hours beneath the heat. As the morning advanced, the villages grew louder and busier. Farmers bent low in fields guiding irrigation water through narrow channels. Stone workers hammered steadily beneath construction scaffolds. Merchants called softly from shaded market stalls. The smell of grain and smoke drifted everywhere. Near a field outside a farming village, a group of laborers harvested barley beneath the growing sun. Bronze blades sliced through the tall stalks while dust and chaff floated through the air around them. One woman carried baskets of harvested grain toward a waiting cart. Another tied bundles carefully with reed rope. The work moved slowly but continuously. Everything in Egyptian agriculture required patience. At midday, the laborers rested beneath a sycamore tree near the edge of the field. The shade felt precious against their overheated skin. Food bundles opened. Bread. Beans. Garlic. Fish dried hard beneath the sun. One younger worker laughed softly while chewing. He said he dreamed sometimes about endless tables filled with every kind of food imaginable. An older woman beside him smiled. And after a few days, she asked, "Would you not still want bread?" The younger worker thought about it and laughed again. "Probably," he admitted. The others nodded knowingly. Bread did more than fill the stomach. It connected people to normal life. During uncertain times, familiar food steadied the mind as much as the body. Far away inside a noble household, servants prepared far richer meals for wealthy officials. Roasted ducks turned slowly above cooking fires. Honey cakes cooled on trays. Bowls of figs and dates rested beside jars of wine. Yet even there, bread remained central. Loaves stood stacked high beside every table. Beer filled cups beside nearly every meal. Egyptian civilization rested upon grain no matter how luxurious certain feasts appeared. In quieter homes across the villages, ordinary women continued preparing simpler foods through the hot afternoon hours. A grandmother stirred lentil stew slowly while sunlight entered her home in thin golden lines through the doorway. Nearby, two children sorted beans carefully into baskets. The grandmother hummed softly while cooking. The smell of onions and herbs filled the room. Outside, heat pressed heavily against the village streets. Dogs slept in the shade beneath carts while flies buzzed lazily through the air. The children asked what they would eat during the next festival. "Perhaps sweet cakes," the grandmother answered. "Perhaps goose if the harvest remains good." The younger child smiled excitedly. But tonight would still be lentils and bread. And somehow nobody seemed disappointed by that. Ordinary meals formed the steady heartbeat of Egyptian life, while richer foods appeared only like brief celebrations drifting through the larger rhythm of routine. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, workers began making their way home once more. Their feet dragged through dust. Their shoulders slumped from exhaustion. Yet the smell of supper fires drifting through the villages gave many of them renewed energy for the final walk home. Inside one small house near the canal, a father arrived carrying a few fish caught after work along the riverbank. His children gathered eagerly around him while his wife prepared bread beside the oven. Tonight's meal would feel slightly special. The fish crackled softly above the fire while lentils simmered nearby. The father washed his hands slowly and sat beside his youngest son, who had already fallen half asleep against the wall from tiredness. Outside, the evening sky deepened into orange and purple above the palm trees. Neighbors sat outside their homes enjoying the cooler air. Voices drifted softly through the streets. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed quietly. The family ate together beneath the flickering light of a small oil lamp. Bread torn carefully by hand. Fish shared equally. Lentils spooned slowly into bowls. Beer passed from one person to another. Simple food. Simple peace. And perhaps that peace mattered more because life remained so physically demanding the rest of the time. After supper, the father stepped outside while darkness settled fully across the Nile Valley. The river reflected moonlight once again while frogs croaked softly among the reeds. He looked toward the fields stretching beyond the village. Tomorrow would bring more labor. More heat. More dust. And almost certainly the same meals once again. Yet he felt no bitterness toward that thought. The familiar rhythm of Egyptian life carried its own quiet comfort. People knew where bread came from. They knew how to prepare it. They knew how to survive beside the river because generations before them had survived the same way. Inside the house, the children had already fallen asleep while their mother wrapped leftover bread carefully for tomorrow morning. Outside, the stars shone steadily above the Nile. And ancient Egypt drifted gently onward through another peaceful night, sustained once more by routine, patience, labor, and the same humble foods shared quietly beside the eternal river. The night settled softly over the Nile one final time. The villages beside the river had grown quiet again. Cooking fires faded into glowing embers. The smell of warm bread and smoke lingered gently in the cooling air while tired families rested behind mud-brick walls beneath the soft flicker of dying oil lamps. Far across the dark water, reeds swayed slowly in the night breeze. The river moved onward with endless patience. As it always had. As it always would. Inside the homes of ancient Egypt, the final sounds of the evening became smaller and softer. A mother wrapped leftover bread carefully in cloth for the morning. A fisherman placed his worn net beside the doorway after another long day upon the river. Children slept close beside their parents while the heavy warmth of the earth slowly faded beneath the night sky. Tomorrow would arrive again before long. The ovens would glow before sunrise. Grinding stones would turn in quiet kitchens. Workers would walk dusty roads toward fields and boats and workshops. And somewhere in the dim blue light before dawn, bread would begin baking once more beside the Nile. The same simple bread. The same familiar meals. The same steady rhythm of life carried gently from one generation to another across the long ancient centuries. Not a life of great luxury. Not a life of endless variety. But a life shaped by routine, by labor, by river water, by warm evenings and tired hands and quiet suppers shared beneath flickering lamps. And perhaps there was comfort in that. A calm kind of comfort. The comfort of knowing what tomorrow would bring. The comfort of hearing the soft crackle of baking fires before sunrise. The comfort of sitting beside family after a difficult day while lentils simmered quietly nearby and the cool night breeze drifted through the reeds outside. Above the Nile Valley, the stars remained bright and patient. The desert rested in silence. The river carried moonlight slowly through the darkness. And ancient Egypt, with all its quiet ordinary lives, slowly faded into the peaceful stillness of night. The workers slept. The ovens cooled. The water flowed gently onward beneath the stars. And somewhere beside the endless river, beneath the warm dark sky of the ancient world, history itself seemed to close its eyes and drift softly into sleep.